Jillian, thank you so much again for taking your time to join us today in this webinar session. I'm just going to ask you to take over right now and then do justice to the presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Brown. Okay, hopefully our screen sharing still works.
Yes, yeah, I can see that.
Fantastic. Yeah, so as Dr. Brown mentioned, I'm Jalen Whaley. I'm the sheep field specialist here at South Dakota State University. I am based out of the western side of South Dakota, and so some of my references today might be more similar to what we see out here in the West, but I really think that all of these concepts still apply regardless to how where you're running your sheep. And so without further ado, we'll jump into some considerations on spring lamb management. I think there's lots of things to talk about. So if you have questions, definitely feel free to drop them in the chat. But when we're looking at spring lambing, a lot of us have already considered, what our markets are, what the opportunities are, the benefits of pushing our lambing back into later in the spring, as opposed to, staying up all night in the wintertime lambing. But I still think there's a lot of ways that we can be developing resiliency regardless of when our lambing season is. And that's really focusing on, I think, these three things: looking at our environmental resiliency, disease resiliency, and nutritional resiliency. And so I'll walk through each of these things, kind of, I guess, building up to mostly a discussion on nutrition. Starting with our environmental resiliency. So I wanted to just throw up, this is the most recent 30-day forecast from NOAA and the National Weather Service. And so I don't know if all of our participants are from Missouri, but regardless of where you're at in the US, you can see kind of what we're predicting for May. And most of the country is going to see slightly above average temperatures. And then there's pieces of the country that are also looking at maybe some above average moisture. So just think about those things as we go into lambing and go through some of these discussions here in a little bit. So starting with kind of just that newborn lamb survival, that's when, really the majority of our losses are occurring within that first 2 weeks of life. And in general, most of those losses are caused by starvation and hypothermia. Hopefully at this stage in our season, we don't have to worry nearly as much about hypothermia. Although here in Western South Dakota, we were still reaching freezing temperatures in the evenings. But in terms of starvation, that's where it's important that even if you're lambing on pasture, we're still making sure that those lambs are getting up and getting nursed. The other thing I want to touch on just really briefly is birth weight. I get a lot of questions about, well, if I'm overfeeding my ewes in late gestation, am I facilitating more dystocia and large lamb issues? And I guess the short answer to that, based on some research out of New Zealand, is no. We actually see more concern with underfeeding our ewes and having lightweight lambs than we do having lambs that are too large. And so you can see in this graph here on the right, and when we kind of graph those average lamb weights, this one is just for singles and twins. These dotted lines highlight kind of those ideal optimal birth weights for both twins and singles. So really, we want lambs that are above 7 and below 12 pounds ideally. That's kind of where these studies found optimal birth weight to be. But at the end of the day, our really light birth weights are going to have the lowest survival. And so that's also something to consider, as we select for breeds that are more prolific and having higher litter numbers. Those lambs are going to be quite a bit smaller just because there's more of them, right? And so just something to consider is as we select for more prolific ewes, we may have to pay a little more attention to those lambs when they're born. And that's where a lot of people have really, shifted to using a shed lambing system as opposed to the pasture lambings. But nevertheless, it can definitely still be done on pasture as well. And so the key there obviously is just really making sure that we're doing everything we can to protect those newborn lambs. As I mentioned, many of us go ahead and run those ewes through a shed. I also hear of a lot of producers that will ultrasound, and if they're lambing in kind of this spring green up period, they'll shed lamb their multiple bearing ewes, but pasture lamb their single bearing ewes. So that's obviously always an option. Consider lambing in pastures that have some natural protection, whether that be trees or shrubs, something like that, just to where those lambs can get in out of the weather if they need to. And then also consider maybe putting out some kind of windbreak or shelter or something to give those lambs the extra edge within those first 2 weeks of life. So as I mentioned, we worry about hypothermia usually in newborn lambs, but I think as we start to get into summer, I also want to just highlight heat stress in our ewes and lambs as well. And so this table comes from an article that myself and a former colleague published on our extension webpage, where you can see the relative humidity across the top and the temperature across the side. And so we really start to see heat stress concerns in our ewes as we approach 85 degrees Fahrenheit and 80% relative humidity, and then start to see severe heat stress as both of those numbers work up. And so some things to think about there, if we are lambing when ewes may be very prone to heat stress, that heat stress is actually going to decrease your milk yields. Your ewes are going to be spending more time trying to cool themselves off than being up and actually nurturing to those lambs. And so again, making sure that's where we're implementing some shelter and shade or some kind of way for our ewes to stay cool is really important if we're lambing during some of these periods of higher temperatures and higher relative humidity. If you are lambing in a shed, definitely make sure that there's adequate ventilation and air movement for those animals. I've seen producers struggle with barns that reach some of these critical temperatures and humidity points. And again, those ewes our milk production goes down pretty significantly. They're spending more time trying to cool off than actually doing their job as a mother. So just keep that in mind. And then of course, water. I can't stress the value of water enough. We know that it's the most important nutrient. And your water intake is dependent on a lot of things. On the type of feed consumed, I'll talk a little bit about the water content in our pastures as we move into spring green up, but especially as we have those ewes on some kind of a dried forage, we're going to see an increase in water intake. As we mentioned before, that environmental temperature is going to highly dictate how much water those ewes are drinking. For a sheep, their thermoneutral zone is anywhere between 24 and 66 degrees Fahrenheit. So those are the temperatures where your ewes are the most comfortable. Stage of production is also going to influence how much water those ewes drink. Obviously, if they're carrying multiple offspring, they're going to be consuming more water. And you can see here just from our, I calculated these numbers out of the small ruminant NRC. You can see just from maintenance, when those ewes are dry, not lactating, not nursing lambs, to as we move into lactation, sometimes we're seeing double, almost triple the amount of water intake. And so again, just really making sure that our ewes have access to clean water. We do worry about, our water quality. If we do approach some drought type situations, we have to start to have concerns with water quality. And also I usually see issues if people are having water intake issues, it's just that the ewes can't access the water properly. So keeping those things in mind. Of course, our intake is also going to be reliant on the amount of rain or dew on our grasses, and then in the winter and snowfall as well, since we know that sheep do a very good job of surviving with water just off of our rain, dew, and snowfall. So just some things to keep in mind. I know it's one of those things that everybody's like, well, yeah, of course we have to have water, but I just think it gets critically important as we get into lactation. Also touching on our predators in our environment. I won't spend a whole lot of time on this. Dr. Brown touched on it a little bit in his article that was sent out with this registration link. But I do think it's important that we touch just briefly on predators. There's also so many great resources online to look at different options for predator management. I think actually I was watching a recorded webinar from this series not too long ago on livestock guardian animals. That was fantastic. So take a look at that if you haven't already. But of course, I think that's probably the most popular use of management strategy is our livestock guardian animals. And we know that they do a great job. It's just a matter of figuring out what type and kind works best on your operation. There's always concern if you live close to town or close to your neighbors on having guard dogs that might wander, things like that. So just take those things into consideration. But I also want to talk a little bit on some other management strategies that don't include another type of animal to take care of. There has been some research looking at flaggery, or just stringing a smooth wire with flags attached. And that does provide some level of deterrent. I was reading an article just a few minutes ago about managing coyote populations. This was actually to protect ferrets, but they saw a 60% reduction in coyotes in that area just by implementing flaggery. I've also seen people use some other forms of stationary deterrence, like using the big inflatable tube people that you see in front of like car dealerships. There's people that have used those. Any kind of stationary light that randomly turns on, basically to stimulate the idea that people are there. And then loud noisemakers, just things like, automated boomsticks and things like that. The issue with using some of our stationary deterrents, even flaggery to some extent, is that those predators do develop basically an immunity to those things. The flaggery they find works for about 60 days on average. And so at that point, then the coyotes are then learning what those things are, learning that they're not a threat. There is also some use of what they call turbo flaggery, or attaching those flags onto an electrified wire, which can help also. But just keep in mind, if you are wanting to try and implement some of these stationary deterrents, there is some level of, I guess, immunity. The coyotes are smart enough to learn and see what those are and learn that they're not a threat. There's also been some really interesting work done at the USDA APHIS Research Center in Logan, Utah. They research a lot of coyote and wolf predation predominantly, but they've been looking at using drones to help deter, specifically for them, it's been wolf attacks, but they have found those drones to be highly effective. They actually, I think you can find Dr. Ranglak's video on YouTube, but they show a really neat video of somebody bringing a drone in and actively stopping a wolf attack on a steer. And so that required, obviously someone managing the drone, but they found what works best is having a drone where you can audibly speak over the drone, and the animal actually thinks that there is a human present. And so that seems to be what has worked the best on some of that drone research. Again, some pitfalls to drones. Obviously, you have to manually be flying that machine. And to get drones that work reliably, sometimes from the distance that you need them, or in different weather conditions, things like that, they can get a little bit pricey. But I think it's some options that are coming out there, and they're looking at some research on it, and could potentially be some use if you're willing to put the work in there. And then finally, I just always really encourage to work with your state agencies. I know it's different in every state. Here in South Dakota, we work really closely with Wildlife Services, but you know, your folks in Extension or your state sheep associations should know which state agencies are best to work with. And so I just always put that plug in that those agencies are there to help you. So don't be afraid to reach out. So with that, I'm going to switch gears here a little bit out of the environmental resiliency and start looking into disease resiliency. And I mean, we could spend all day talking about our different disease concerns when it comes to young lambs. What I'm really going to focus on today is our clostridial diseases, coccidiosis, and then of course our worm burdens as we move into more of a pasture-based system. I'll touch really briefly here on navel ill. It's one of those that's just super easy to manage for, making sure that our jugs are clean, our lambing environments are clean, and then using a simple iodine-based navel dip always is a great way to just ensure that that's a right off the bat easy way to have some insurance on lamb survival. Moving into our clostridial diseases, this is one that most of us have in our vaccination protocols already. But sometimes I think it's important just to go over why we vaccinate, or maybe look at maybe other ways that we could be using these vaccines. So our Clostridium preventions type C and D is the ones that we vaccinate for. You may have also heard it called enterotoxemia, overeating disease, or pulpy kidney. And this bacteria also comes in other forms. So type A and E can also affect lambs, but those are a lot more rare, which is why right now we really only have a vaccine for C and D. But that's not to say they can't occur ever. So type C is typically seen in our much younger lambs. And it's going to look like just some scours. And if you were to do a necropsy, you might see some intestinal hemorrhaging that's going to cause that intestine to look dark red or almost purple colored. Whereas type D is our more, I guess, classical enterotoxemia that we think about. That's our overeating disease, or sometimes called pulpy kidney. And that's just when we see this increase in bacterial growth within the animal's gut, usually given increasing our concentrates in our diet, making some kind of large diet change, or we often see it in our orphan lambs when we're changing that milk consumption. And so just to talk really briefly about our vaccination protocols, everybody has something a little bit different, and everything works for everybody a little differently. But one thing I think that is some interesting research that we've really started to look into is looking at that animal's immune system function as a newborn. So our ruminants truthfully don't have a fully developed immune system until about 14 days of age. And so until those animals are 2 weeks, in some cases, their body doesn't even know how to create those immune responses that it needs to. And so that's where we heavily rely, like you can see in this orange bar on this graph, we heavily rely on those maternal antibodies that those lambs are getting from colostrum. So then we can give that primary injection of C and D at approximately 14 days of age, when that animal can actually begin to initiate an immune response. And then just following label instructions, usually that's about 21 or so days later, we would give that secondary injection to our lambs. And then I usually recommend an annual booster to our flock about 3 to 4 weeks prior to lambing. That allows our ewes to then get another booster of that of those antibodies that are then going to be transferred to the lamb through colostrum. I also usually put a plug in there about making sure that we are getting a C&D plus tetanus. You can get a C&D without tetanus. However, whether you're banding or using some kind of a hot docker or something of that sort, it's really important that we're protecting those lambs against tetanus as well. That's naturally going to be living in the soil. Looking at coccidiosis, I get questions on this one quite a bit also. We tend to see it a lot more in lambs that are managed in kind of a dry lot type setting. But what's interesting about coccidiosis is that it is a host-specific protozoa. And so if you're running multiple species on your operation, just because one species might see a coccidiosis outbreak, you may not see it in your other species. However, that also means that those other species may be carrying pathogenic versions of that Eimeria. And so in sheep, we really only consider 2 different strains of that Eimeria protozoa as an issue. Again, we're also often seeing issues there with young lambs. I would say I do hear concerns from producers when those lambs are about a month old. It seems like they start to see some issues. High stocking densities and moist, warm climates, just like many of our diseases, obviously also don't help with our coccidia problems. The struggles with coccidiosis is that it is often asymptomatic. A lot of times if I have a producer asking questions, it's, I had this great big healthy single lamb and I went out in the pasture and he was just dead. And so we do often see it as asymptomatic. People will sometimes misdiagnose it as well, that lamb just wasn't getting enough to eat. And if you do a necropsy, sometimes you can see some intestinal damage because those protozoa are essentially putting their eggs within the cells of the intestinal wall, and then that cell ruptures, releasing those oocytes. And so the only way really to test and get positive, like definite results, is to go ahead and do a fecal float for oocytes, or you can also do a postmortem intestinal scraping. Fortunately, as long as you get ahead of it, there is a lot of options for treatment. Most of the time we're looking at a coccidiostat, whether that be something like amprolium or decoquinate. There is also a lot of research out there showing that our ionophores that are sometimes added to our feeds anyways can help limit our coccidiosis outbreaks. And then our sulfonamides can also help with that. If you know that you have a coccidia problem, you can take a prophylactic approach. And so a lot of times, most commonly, I think I would see people providing that amprolium either in the feed or in the water. The caveat I will put there is if you are using that water-based amprolium, it's critical that when you put the dosage in the water, those lambs are drinking that entire tank down before allowing that water to refill. So for example, if you're using like automatic waters, those can be extremely problematic if that's how you're administering your amprolium, because the constant addition of that water is going to continue to dilute your amprolium, and those lambs may not actually get the amount that they need. The other thing that you can do is there are feed options for decoquinate also, but you can also put 2 pounds of decoquinate for 50 pounds of free choice salt, just as another prophylactic approach. But usually our big issue with coccidiosis is the fact that if we look at our ewes, those animals are able to manage that coccidia within their intestine. And so mature ewes are going to shed very few oocytes if that's present. But once your lambs pick it up, that's when we see this maximizer effect, or tons of oocytes shed into the environment because their bodies just aren't, they haven't developed that immunity to self-limit that disease. Again, probably another topic that you could spend an entire hour, if not hours on, but I'll just touch really briefly on our worm burdens as we turn out to pasture. especially if you're lambing, we have to consider this periparturient rise. And so that's just when our ewes are shedding higher numbers of fecal egg counts just due to that short-term drop in immunity because their body is so stressed, lambing and lactating and those kind of things. And that periparturient rise can last, anywhere from 2 to 8 weeks. And if we are accompanying this with pasture turnout, I think it's something we definitely have to consider because those eggs and worms are going to survive much better on pasture than they will in a barn or a dry lot type setting. The other thing to keep in mind when we're out on pasture is that most worms are going to travel about 3 inches up that plant. And so especially this time of year when we maybe are just getting some new growth and those plants aren't nearly as tall as normal, but we're reaching temperatures where those worms are actually able to hatch and larvae will make their way up our plants. That's something to just keep in mind. And then of course, as we move into the season, we always want to avoid overgrazing our pastures, especially below kind of that 3-inch mark. And then another thing to consider is just making sure that we're rotating our pastures without actually contaminating our clean pastures. So if you have pastures that you've never had a worm problem on, we don't want to turn ewes and lambs out that are actively shedding eggs onto those pastures. And so we want to make sure that if we're rotating through our pastures, that we're deworming and waiting a minimum of 3 to 4 days. That's just how long it takes for that anthelmintic to actually become active in the body, kill those worms, and for the ewes to shed what remaining eggs they have. I've seen suggestions up to 7 to 10 days as well. But that 3 to 4 days is kind of our minimum before moving them onto a clean pasture. And I won't go through it, but I also just wanted to provide some of our oral drench dewormers. And again, I can provide this as a fact sheet that's on our extension webpage, but especially this time of year, I usually do recommend an oral drench just because that anthelmintic is getting directly to the problem. We know that most of our concern is with our barber pole worm, which is in the abomasum. And so if we can get that drug directly to where the worm is at, there's a little better success rate as opposed to like your injectables or things like that. But for some people, those other options are just the better option for them, and that's fine. But I just wanted to make sure that you have an idea of some of our approved oral dewormers. So then moving into our nutritional resiliency, here we're really going to talk about the fact that ewe nutrition is equally as important as our lamb nutrition, especially as we get into kind of peak lactation. On the lamb side, we always want to consider proper rumen development. I'll talk a little bit through creep feeding, which if you're pasture lambing, that may or may not be something you're doing. And then we'll conclude with some pasture nutrition considerations. So rumen development is extremely important, especially if our plan is to get those lambs onto a finishing ration. And there's been a lot of research looking at the effects of providing multiple feedstuffs and the importance of those feedstuffs to rumen development. And so as you can see, these are some pictures from Penn State, but we're looking at the lining of the rumen in these images. And so when those lambs are provided milk only, you can see that rumen wall is very light colored, indicating that maybe there wasn't as much capillary development there. You also don't see it looks smooth, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And so our rumen heavily relies on the individual finger-like papilla development for nutrient absorption. And we see a much more limited papilla development when those lambs are provided milk only. Things look a little bit better when we provide milk and hay. You can start to see there's a little bit more color, indicating that there's a little bit more blood flow to that rumen, and maybe a little bit more texture to that rumen wall as well. And then it gets even darker and we start to see a lot more texture as those animals are fed milk and grain. And so what's really important is we're trying to balance making sure that we're not getting an overgrowth of papilla development with solely milk and grain, but we're also not, we're also promoting proper development of what that animal needs to properly absorb nutrients. And so again, if you are on pasture and maybe thinking, well, I'm not going to provide those animals grain, a lot of these studies again have been done with hay and grain. We know that our pastures are higher quality nutritionally than just a dried hay. And so those animals are also going to be selecting for various parts of the plant and things like that. And so I think there's still plenty of opportunity for ideal rumen development, even on pasture. But there is some benefit there to providing at least a little bit of a concentrate. And then also just a quick note that our rumen inoculation occurs from the dam and the environment. And so for the lamb to properly develop the rumen microflora that they need, they're going to develop that both from their mother and the environment. So touching just a little bit on creep feed, we do know that younger lambs are more feed efficient. And so if we can provide some creep feed to those younger lambs, we're going to see much higher average daily gains than if we were to introduce a grain to an older lamb. In some cases, increasing your weaning weights is going to allow you to market those lambs a little bit earlier. So if for some reason you need to sell earlier or you want to hit a different market opportunity, that's where creep feeding can really benefit you. One option that I see some producers using, especially if you're trying to work on some kind of an accelerated system where we're asking those ewes to produce lambs fairly regularly, is moving into an early weaning system where we're weaning those lambs at 45 to 60 days instead of 90 to 120. And so kind of using that scenario of an early wean at 60 days as opposed to 90, we're putting those ewes in a maintenance ration 30 days earlier. And so we can feed those ewes at a much lower level. And just based on very generalized current hay prices, I know they vary significantly across the country. But you know, you could save approximately $5 a head per ewe by weaning those lambs a little bit early. A high quality creep needs to be moderate to high in protein. So we're looking at kind of that 17 to 20%. We can get there with some of our feed ingredients like soybean meal or your dried distillers grains. But it also needs to be very high in energy. So 70 to 75% TDN. And obviously our token energy feed stuff is corn, but you can use higher levels of oats and barley as well. Optimally, we want our creep feed to be low in fiber because we know that if we increase fiber, we decrease ease of digestibility. But again, providing that hay is going to also facilitate our rumen development. We want that feed to be highly palatable, so a lot of people will add a molasses or something like that to their creep feed just to promote consumption. And in general, we want to have consumption, especially in an early weaning system, of about a ½ pound per head per day before weaning those lambs. And there is some suggestion that creating a pelleted creep or like a cake type creep might have better intake. But I can also say if you mix that with something else, you might see some sorting. So then kind of switching gears, if you are one of those pasture lambing operations, and you certainly can provide creep and a creep feeder on pasture as well. But many of us raise lambs on pasture because we know it's the cheaper feed option. Usually pasture is about 1/3 of the cost of harvested feed, depending on the different feed stuff. and probably dependent on your pastoral rental rates and things like that. But this is a really great opportunity to provide really high nutrition at a really relatively low cost. And so some things just to keep in mind is that our new growth in those grasses is hopefully you all are seeing green up faster than we are. But that new growth is really high in nutrients, but it's also high in water. And so your water consumption may go down a little bit, but those ewes are also going to have to consume a lot more grass to get the dry matter that they need. And then again, and Dr. Brown highlights this in his article as well, but you are going to see lower gains, obviously, on pasture. So if you're wanting to hit certain markets and you need those lambs to grow faster than, 0.2 to 0.3 pounds per day, you might want to consider incorporating a concentrate. But many of us that pasture lamb know that we're going to market those lambs a little bit later. So this is probably more of a Western South Dakota grass type profile. But again, I think same concepts apply for your grass profiles regardless. So right now we're seeing more growth in our cool season plants, and we'll see those warm season plants start to pick up, June, July time period. But what you can see here, the purple, blue, and blue lines are just 4 different grass species at different stages. And then the red dotted line is our ewe requirements. Starting at the highest point there is going to be early lactation, moving through mid to late lactation, and then potentially weaning those lambs, August or September as we drop into maintenance requirements. And so really what you can see is that for most of this late spring and early summer, our cool season grasses are going to meet our crude protein requirements for those ewes. So again, a large reason why we lamb on pastures, because our sheep are naturally forage consuming animals, and those forages always seem to supply what we need when we need them. And then just another reminder, many of our grasses, you'll see here, we're staging this based on the 2.5 leaf stage or the 3.5 leaf stage. Just to promote proper growth on our plants, we really want to make sure we're not grazing those plants until they're at kind of that 3 to 3.5 leaf stage. They need lots of solar panels to grow as well. And so we want to make sure that we're not grazing those forages too early and damaging our cool season grasses. And then I kind of want to conclude just on a quick thought on providing minerals. I think there's a lot of research out there that supports how important our minerals are. But especially during late gestation and peak lactation, we are seeing an increase in lamb survival because we're seeing a greater placental and colostrum transfer of those trace minerals to our lambs. We also know that we are facilitating some disease prevention. If those ewes have adequate mineral levels, those lambs are then not going to face things like your white muscle disease or something like that we have to worry about. It also prevents some subclinical issues. So even if you're not seeing evident mineral deficiencies, selenium is one of those in particular that we can sometimes just see decreased gains on our lambs if we have insufficient selenium. And so in one study, it showed that ewes that were supplemented with some excess selenium actually weaned heavier lambs. And so I would say that most of the time, excess mineral isn't necessarily going to have additional benefit, but not meeting our mineral requirements is going to have some detriments. And so also just make sure you are monitoring consumption. We don't want those ewes over consuming from just a cost benefit purpose. We know that mineral isn't always the cheapest thing we feed. And so making sure that those ewes are consuming that target intake is really important. Another thing to just consider is there is some research that shows that ewes consuming too much iodine can actually decrease your immunoglobulin absorption in those lambs. And so again, like I said, a lot of times if we're feeding excess mineral, we may not see additional benefit, but not meeting our mineral requirements is going to lead to some problems. Another thing to keep in mind is if your ewes are in confinement, they're probably less likely to consume minerals than once you turn those ewes out to pasture. Where we often see a 3 to 10% non-consumer in our confined ewes, whereas our grazing ewes are going to consume usually 1.5 times more mineral. And again, part of that is just their bodies telling them what they need. But again, keep in mind, I think all too often, if anything, I see producers like, oh my gosh, I fill my mineral tubs all the time. Well, if that target intake is, or I guess follow your target intake, and if that 50-pound bag should last you a week, don't refill that bag before that week is up. Refill that tub before that week is up. Because even if those ewes are highly consuming a mineral, again, those additional minerals aren't probably helping you a whole lot. It's just eating another hole in our pocket. So just something to consider. Again, as you wean those lambs, maybe our forages, especially if you have a high forb or high brush type pasture, once those ewes are dried off and in maintenance, most of the time our pastures will meet a mineral requirement. So that's where strategic mineral supplementation can also be really important. And so with that, we can switch over to questions. I've covered a lot of material today, so hopefully I hope y'all don't feel like you were just drinking from a fire hose.
Thank you so much. That was very informative. That was very in-depth. Thank you for that presentation. Of course, we could have 3 takeaways: environmental resilience, disease, and nutritional resilience. So please, it's time for question. You want to unmute yourself, you want to type your question so she can take a look and answer those. But while we're waiting for that, Jenna, do you want to tell us about the market outlook, kind of the way it looks like in South Dakota when it comes to marketing the spring lambs? How does that look like over there? And do we have any similarities here in Missouri? Because that's one of the questions people ask, why they don't want to go into spring lamb production because of getting market for that. What's your idea about that, please?
Yeah, here in Western South Dakota, I would actually say probably the majority of our producers are lambing this time of year. Historically, what we see in the markets is, we see that rise at the Easter market, which is where our fall lambing folks really help out. Yeah. But then we start to see a really large drop off in the market as we go through July and August. And, about 85% of the lambs in the US are born in those first 5 months of the year. Yeah. And then they're marketed in that kind of summer market. And so the benefit to potentially late spring lambing is that you might hit where that market starts to pick back up as we get into September, October. And holding on to those lambs and marketing them in the fall can sometimes have some price advantages.
Oh, great. Thank you for that. Appreciate that. Somebody also was asking me about parasite control. Of course, I know we dealt a lot about that. You touch on that too. When it comes to using some of these other alternatives instead of using the dewormer because of resistance. Of course, I was talking to a producer about the use of garlic and papaya and all this stuff, where I told them, of course, those have not been, there's no evidence to the fact that really works. But do you want to say something to our producers on that, please, based on your experience?
Yeah, I haven't seen out here a whole lot of producers using things like garlic and whatnot. I know that the cattle guys have used it a little bit for more of our external parasite control. There isn't a whole lot of research out there on some of those alternative methods. But I also think that there's a lot to be said about our genetic potential. The industry's really been pushing towards finding animals that can essentially tolerate higher worm burdens or have those lower fecal egg count scores. And so if we can strategically cull our animals, and if we see an animal that, oh, that one obviously has a worm problem, and culling those animals, we can start to make our animals more genetically enhanced to handle those worms a little bit better. But I don't have a lot of experience with some of those alternative methods. And I think some of it goes back to also, I can go back to the slide, but switching our classes of dewormers. You may not necessarily have to deworm every single sheep. We have those tools like FAMACHA scoring and assessing, you know, the nose, ears, and back end of our sheep to strategically deworm. But then also rotating our classes of wormers helps fight some of that refugia also.
Great, great. Thank you. You mentioned flags on fences. You want to touch a bit on that, please? Yeah, if that really, I've seen a couple of those, you know, even back in Africa, you know. So you want to talk on flags on fences, flattery, what you talked about the other time, please?
Yeah, so flaggery, yeah, like you said, is just attaching those flags. We usually want them to be low enough to the ground that they are in the line of sight for a coyote. Those coyotes are going to duck under fences. And just as the wind blows, as the coyote sees these foreign objects along the fence, it sometimes can create a deterrent where it's something new and novel they maybe don't want to approach. And there's resources online where you can, it's also kind of a relatively cheap option to buy a simple smooth wire and just plastic tape. Usually they're recommending red or orange. And then space those out. I don't remember off the top of my head. I believe that they said a minimum of 18 inches, or about 18 inches between individual flags.
Oh, great. Jayla, you want to talk about just keep my mind right now. Yeah, crib feeding, you know, yeah. Someone asked me if it's actually very important for us to, and I know you touched on that, but you just want to expand on crib feeding, particularly during the spring period when the lamb is foraging with the dam, you know, do we need to consider, and you're not trying to sell off the lamb, do you recommend crib feeding at that stage?
Yeah, when they're on pasture.
Yes, when they're on pasture, yes.
Yeah, I think there's obviously some concern there with depending on pasture size. Those lambs may or may not come into the creep feeders. We know that our pastures are extremely high in protein and in energy. But again, not nearly as high as our creep feeds are going to be. And so that's where I think you really have to look at your market options and when you want to market and what your target weight is for your lambs at market. We again need to make sure that creep feed is somewhere where the lambs are able to access it. And so, yeah, I guess that would be my big concern is that those lambs are actually going to actively seek out the creep feed. If we have really good lush pastures, they may not. And so that's where there definitely could be some concern.
Great. Okay, last question. Someone sent this over that is there a good time to lamb? Like I just said in my article, is based on your experience on what you've just presented, would you say is there best time to lamb? Are you willing to lamb in the fall? You willing to lamb in spring? What is your take on that as we wrap up this presentation today?
Yeah, so I would give the stereotypical extension answer of it depends.
It depends, yeah.
I don't think that there's necessarily a wrong answer there. It's totally dependent on how much you want to put in as a producer. We certainly know that lambing on pasture has its perks. It's a lot less labor intensive. We can basically let those sheep out to just be sheep and lamb extensively on pasture. And capitalize on a feedstuff that is already growing naturally at a relatively cheap cost, which is all the things we talked about today, which is the benefit to lambing this time of year. However, I think there's lots of opportunities, like you said, for fall lambing, for accelerated lambing systems. Where if you want to push those ewes and have multiple lambing periods, we are going to have a little bit more stepped up nutrition that often requires more of a confinement lambing type system. Again, going into the early weaning scenario, those animals just require so much more in terms of feedstuffs. Also, if you're looking at marketing potentially any type of seed stock, or registered sheep, a lot of people want to lamb those a little bit earlier so that if you're selling stud bucks, those bucks are mature enough to actually breed ewes when our producers need them to. And so I don't think there's a right or wrong answer. When we look at the commercial markets, we know when our seasonal fluctuations are. We know that it picks up around Christmas and picks up around Easter and drops off in the summer. But if you're using some of those more non-traditional market channels, even if you're direct marketing or marketing into the ethnic market, those market fluctuations are so much different that I think it's really finding the management system that works best for you.
Great. Thank you so much. I've been able to ask you a few questions that were sent to me. We didn't have any question online, but those are the questions sent to me, while people registering for this session. I want to once again thank Jillian. William, thank you for your time, for your expertise, and that was very informative. We're going to make sure we share these presentation to everyone that registered today. Once again, thank you for joining us in our May edition of University of Missouri Extension Small Ruminant Online Seminar. Your host is David Brown, sheep and goat specialist. Jillian, once again, thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you again in the future. Have a beautiful day. Bye.
Thank you.